For years, I had been the silent, often invisible cornerstone of my husband David's extended family, the one who diligently, uncomplainingly navigated the treacherous, often emotionally exhausting currents of their complex internal dynamics. I, Clara Evans, had always prided myself on being a loving wife, a devoted mother to our two wonderful children, 16-year-old Chloe and 13-year-old Sam, and a generally agreeable, if somewhat reserved, daughter-in-law. I had married into the Evans family nearly 2 decades ago, a wide-eyed, optimistic young woman deeply in love with David, a kind, gentle, if sometimes frustratingly passive man. Our own small family unit, our cozy suburban home filled with laughter, love, and the comforting chaos of raising 2 active children was my sanctuary, my haven, the place where I felt truly seen, truly valued. However, the wider Evans family, particularly David's younger, more flamboyant, and undeniably more venomous sister Linda, was an entirely different and infinitely more challenging ecosystem. From the very beginning of my marriage, Linda had, for reasons I could never fully comprehend, singled me out as the target of her subtle yet persistent campaign of disdain, of belittlement, of insidious behind-the-back character assassination. She was a woman who thrived on drama, on being the center of attention, on subtly, or sometimes not so subtly, undermining anyone she perceived as a threat, or perhaps simply as different from her own, rather narrow materialistic worldview. And I, with my quiet demeanor, my preference for intellectual pursuits over social grandstanding, my lack of interest in designer labels or idle gossip was, it seemed, the perfect irresistible foil for her particular brand of passive-aggressive cruelty. For years, I had silently, stoically endured her insults, her whispers, her carefully crafted insinuations. At first, I tried with a naivete that now makes me cringe to ignore her petty jabs, to dismiss her barbed comments as mere products of a difficult personality, of a perhaps unrecognized insecurity on her part. I focused on maintaining a peaceful, harmonious relationship with David, on shielding our children from the uglier undercurrents of their extended family dynamics. I told myself that Nguyen family members, as my own mother used to say, with a sigh of resignation, were a fixed constellation, their orbits unchangeable, their behaviors often best endured rather than confronted. I believed with a misplaced, almost martyr-like patience, that my quiet dignity, my unwavering commitment to family harmony would eventually somehow win her over, or at least earn her grudging respect. How wrong, how profoundly, devastatingly wrong I was. Linda's campaign of quiet warfare against me was a masterclass in insidious, deniable aggression. It rarely involved overt public confrontations, which would have been too crude, too obvious for her preferred style of combat. Instead, it was a relentless barrage of subtle digs, of backhanded compliments, of carefully planted seeds of doubt and misinformation, all designed to slowly, systematically erode my standing within the family, to paint me as inadequate, as less than, as somehow unworthy of her brother of the Evans name. She would make snide, dismissive comments about my career as a part-time librarian and freelance historical researcher. A career I was deeply passionate about, a career that allowed me the flexibility to be present for my children, but one that in Linda's materialistic eyes clearly lacked the requisite glamour or financial heft. "Oh, Clara, still pottering about with your dusty old books, are you?" She'd coo at family gatherings, her voice dripping with a false, cloying sweetness that barely concealed the underlying contempt. Such a quaint little hobby, though I can't imagine it pays very much, does it, dear? Still, I suppose it keeps you occupied. She would find fault with my parenting, subtly undermining my decisions, offering unsolicited and invariably critical advice on everything from Chloe's choice of extracurricular activities. Ballet, Clara, really isn't that a bit precious? My Tiffany is excelling at competitive cheerleading so much more dynamic. To Sam's perfectly normal, boisterous 13-year-old energy. "He's a bit wild, isn't he? Clara, perhaps a firmer hand is needed. David was never so unruly as a child. She would critique my home, my cooking, my clothes, always with that same infuriating condescending air of feigned concern. Your lasagna is interesting, Clara. A very unique blend of spices. Not quite how Mother used to make it, of course, but different. Or, that dress is comfortable looking, dear. So very practical. Each word, each carefully chosen adjective was a tiny poison-tipped dart designed to prick, to wound, to subtly reinforce her narrative of my supposed inadequacy, my inherent inferiority. And she was a master, an absolute virtuoso of the behind-the-back whisper, the insidious insinuation, the carefully crafted rumor designed to sow discord, to create doubt, to poison my relationships with other members of David's family. I would often walk into a room to find conversations abruptly ceasing, heads turning a sudden uncomfortable silence descending, followed by forced overly bright smiles and a too quick change of subject. I knew with a sickening certainty that I had once again been the topic of Linda's latest venomous dissection. I would hear through the reluctant, embarrassed reports of other more sympathetic or perhaps simply less aligned with Linda family members snippets of her slander, that I was lazy, unambitious, socially awkward, not supportive enough of David's career. Even on one particularly outrageous occasion that I was secretly squandering David's hard-earned money on frivolous online shopping, a projection I suspected of her own rather extravagant spending habits. The cumulative effect of this relentless, insidious campaign of emotional attrition was devastating. I felt constantly on edge, hyper-vigilant, second-guessing my every word, my every action, desperately trying to avoid giving Linda any new ammunition for her arsenal of criticism. My self-confidence, once a quiet, steady flame, began to flicker to dim, eroded by the constant drip, drip, drip of her negativity, her disapproval. I began to feel isolated even within the boisterous, often overwhelming embrace of the larger Evans clan. I was the outsider, the black sheep, the one who didn't quite belong, the one who was perpetually, and it seemed irrevocably, found wanting. David, my husband, the man who should have been my staunchest defender, my unwavering ally in this silent, soul-crushing war, was to my profound, enduring disappointment largely absent. Not physically, perhaps, but emotionally, morally. He loved me. I believed in his own quiet, undemonstrative way, but he was also undeniably a man who abhorred conflict, a man who had from childhood been conditioned to appease, to placate his often demanding and notoriously sharp-tongued younger sister. When I would, in moments of desperate, tearful frustration, try to share with him the pain Linda's words, her actions were causing me, his responses were invariably dismissive, minimizing, almost impatient. "Oh, come on, Clara." He'd sigh, his gaze often still fixed on the television or his phone. "You're being too sensitive." "That's just Linda being Linda. She doesn't mean anything by it. She's just a bit direct. You know how she is. Just ignore her. Don't let her get to you." Ignore her? How could I ignore a constant barrage of subtle and not so subtle attacks on my character, my parenting, my very worth as a human being? Don't let her get to me. Her barbs were already lodged deep within my heart, festering, poisoning my peace of mind, eroding my sense of self. His inability, or perhaps his unwillingness to see to acknowledge the true extent of Linda's malice, her deliberate, calculated cruelty, was in many ways almost more painful, more damaging than Linda's actions themselves. It left me feeling utterly, profoundly alone, undefended, adrift in a sea of familial hostility, with no lifeline, no anchor, no one to truly understand or even validate the silent, invisible scars she was so expertly, so relentlessly inflicting upon my soul. And so, for years, I endured. I smiled politely through gritted teeth. I absorbed the insults, the slights, the humiliations, with a practiced, almost masochistic stoicism. I told myself it was for David's sake, for the children's sake, for the sake of maintaining some semblance of fragile, superficial family harmony. I convinced myself that my silence, my forbearance, was a sign of strength of maturity, of rising above her petty vindictive games. But deep down, a part of me, a small, resilient, and increasingly angry part, knew that my silence was not strength. It was fear. It was acquiescence. It was in a very real sense a betrayal of myself. And that hidden, smoldering ember of righteous indignation, I would soon discover, was far from extinguished. It was merely waiting, biding its time for the right moment, the right catalyst to erupt into an all-consuming and ultimately transformative conflagration. The final, irrevocable catalyst, the incident that shattered my long-held, deeply ingrained pattern of silent endurance and propelled me towards a course of action I had never in my wildest imaginings thought myself capable of, was not, as one might expect, a particularly egregious public humiliation or a dramatically escalated act of overt aggression from Linda. No, it was something far quieter, far more insidious, and in its own way, far more devastating, the dawning, heartbreaking realization that Linda's relentless, venomous campaign against me was beginning to directly and poisonously impact my precious children, particularly my sensitive, observant 16-year-old daughter, Chloe. Chloe, who had always shared a close, if sometimes typically teenage turbulent bond with her Aunt Linda, a bond Linda had, I now realized, with a sickening clarity likely cultivated with a manipulative long-term strategic intent, began over a period of several unsettling months to exhibit subtle but deeply worrying changes in her own behavior, her own attitude specifically and most painfully towards me. She became more distant, more critical, her usual easygoing affection for me often replaced by a new, unfamiliar, and deeply unsettling, almost dismissive impatience. She started echoing with an almost parrot-like, unthinking accuracy some of Linda's more frequent and more insidious criticisms of my parenting, of my lifestyle, of my very character. "Mom, why do you always wear those sensible shoes Aunt Linda says a woman should always make an effort, even if she's just running errands?" Chloe might remark, her tone a casual, almost innocent echo of her aunt's snobbery. Yet each word a tiny, painful pinprick to my already bruised maternal heart. Or Aunt Linda thinks it's really important for Sam and me to have more cultured experiences. She said maybe you should take us to the opera sometimes instead of just, the local library. The implication, of course, was that my own more modest and perhaps less overtly cultured efforts to enrich their lives were somehow lacking inadequate a reflection of my own supposed provincialism. The most devastating blow, however, the incident that finally irrevocably shattered my long-held, deeply ingrained pattern of silent stoic endurance and propelled me towards a course of action I had never in my wildest, most desperate imaginings thought myself capable of occurred during a seemingly innocuous mother-daughter conversation about Chloe's future college aspirations. Chloe, a bright, articulate, and passionately artistic young woman, had always dreamed of attending a prestigious out-of-state liberal arts college with a renowned fine arts program. It was an ambitious dream, a financially challenging one for our modest family budget, but one that I, and to his credit, even David had always wholeheartedly supported, promising to do whatever it took to make whatever sacrifices were necessary to help her achieve it. But that evening, as we were casually discussing application deadlines and potential scholarship opportunities, Chloe suddenly, and with a chilling, almost uncharacteristic air of defeat, announced, "Mom, maybe Aunt Linda is right. Maybe I should just apply to the local community college for a couple of years. It's probably more realistic for someone like me, for someone from our kind of family." Her words so devoid of her usual passionate ambition, so tinged with a new, unfamiliar, and utterly heartbreaking note of self-doubt, of resignation, hit me with the force of a physical blow. "Realistic, Chloe," I stammered, my heart constricting with a sudden fierce pain. "What on earth are you talking about? You're one of the most talented, most intelligent, most deserving young women I know. Of course you should aim for the very best." Why would she say something so discouraging? Chloe hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap, a telltale flush rising on her cheeks. "Well," she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. She just said that. That people like us, people who don't come from, money or connections, we shouldn't get our hopes up too high. That it's better to be practical, to know our place. She said that even if I did manage to get into one of those fancy art colleges, we probably couldn't afford it anyway, and that I'd just end up disappointing everyone, especially myself. And she said that maybe if I was really smart, I'd focus on a more sensible career, like bookkeeping, or maybe even if I worked really hard, I could become a dental hygienist like her friend's daughter, who apparently makes quite a decent, respectable living for a girl. The sheer, unadulterated, soul-crushing cruelty of Linda's words, her deliberate, malicious attempt to extinguish my daughter's bright, ambitious flame, to confine her to Linda's own narrow, snobbish, and deeply prejudiced definition of realistic and appropriate, ignited within me a rage so profound, so visceral, so utterly all-consuming that it momentarily, terrifyingly eclipsed every other emotion. This was no longer just about me. This was no longer just about Linda's petty jealousies, her social snobbery, her desire to make me feel small. This was about my child. This was about Linda actively, deliberately trying to sabotage my daughter's future, to poison her dreams, to instill in her the same crippling self-doubt, the same sense of inherent inadequacy that she had for so many years tried with varying degrees of success to inflict upon me. And in that moment, looking at Chloe's downcast, vulnerable face, at the tears of confusion and dawning despair welling in her beautiful, intelligent eyes, I knew with an absolute, unshakable, and almost terrifying certainty that my years of silent endurance, of polite forbearance, of turning the other cheek, were well and truly and irrevocably over. The line had been crossed. The battle, whether I wanted it or not, had been joined. And I, Clara Evans, the quiet, unassuming, ordinary wife and mother, was about to unleash a storm of righteous fury, of meticulously gathered truth upon my unsuspecting and soon to be very, very sorry sister-in-law. My decision, forged in the crucible of that heartbreaking conversation with Chloe and fueled by a mother's fierce, primal, and utterly non-negotiable need to protect her young, was not to engage in a futile, emotionally draining shouting match with Linda, nor was it to simply withdraw further to allow her insidious poison to continue to seep into the heart of my family. No, my decision was to fight back, but I would fight back on my own terms, with my own weapons, truth evidence, and a carefully, strategically orchestrated public unmasking. I knew from years of bitter experience that Linda was a master of plausible deniability, of twisting words, of playing the innocent victim when confronted. Simply accusing her, however vehemently, however justly, would likely achieve nothing but further frustration, further denial, and perhaps even further, more subtle retaliation. If I was going to expose her, if I was going to silence her, if I was going to ensure that she and the rest of the Evans family finally truly understood the profound, lasting damage her malicious gossip, her insidious manipulations had caused, I needed more than just my word against hers. I needed irrefutable, undeniable, and preferably very public proof. And so, my clandestine and deeply reluctant career as an amateur private investigator, a collector of damning evidence against my own sister-in-law, began. It was a role I undertook with a heavy heart, with a profound sense of sadness at the utter tragic and seemingly irreparable breakdown of what should have been a supportive, loving, familial relationship. But it was also a role I embraced with a new, almost chilling sense of focused, unwavering determination. I started by meticulously, almost obsessively documenting every instance of Linda's past and ongoing slanderous behavior. I went back through years of my own journals, my old emails, even my mental archives, dredging up specific dated examples of her cutting remarks, her backhanded compliments, her insidious reputation, damaging whispers. I encouraged Chloe very gently, very carefully, to also write down in her own words every instance she could recall of Linda's discouraging, undermining, or manipulative comments towards her, particularly those related to her college aspirations and her perceived social standing. Then I began to reach out very cautiously, very discreetly to other members of the Evans family. Individuals I had always sensed were perhaps not entirely enthralled by Linda's often overbearing personality, individuals who might have also at times been the target of her sharp tongue or her manipulative games. My mother-in-law, a generally kind if somewhat traditional and easily influenced woman, I knew often expressed private frustration with Linda's more flamboyant extravagances and her often insensitive remarks. David's older, more reserved, and generally more thoughtful brother Michael had also on occasion let slip a few exasperated comments about Linda's constant need for drama and her penchant for stirring up trouble. This was by far the most delicate, most challenging part of my evidence-gathering mission. I had to approach them with extreme tact, with absolute discretion, framing my inquiries not as an attempt to gather dirt on Linda or to instigate a family feud, but as a desperate, heartfelt plea from a concerned mother and a wounded sister-in-law, seeking only to understand and ultimately to stop the source of so much unnecessary pain and division within the family. To my surprise and immense relief, several of them, once they understood the true insidious extent of Linda's long-standing campaign against me, and more importantly, once they realized the devastating impact her words were now having on my innocent, ambitious daughter Chloe, were not just sympathetic, they were quietly, profoundly outraged. They began to share their own previously undisclosed experiences with Linda's manipulative behavior, her propensity for gossip, her often cruel sense of humor at others' expense. Some, even with a new shared sense of righteous indignation, provided me with copies of old emails or recounted specific dated conversations where Linda had indeed spoken ill of me, disparaged my character, or actively sought to undermine my relationship with David or other family members. The evidence was mounting piece by damning piece, painting a clear, undeniable, and deeply unflattering portrait of Linda Evans, not as the charming, witty, and sophisticated woman she so desperately, so performatively projected to the world, but as a deeply insecure, intensely jealous, and chronically manipulative individual. A woman who seemed to derive a perverse sense of power, of satisfaction, from subtly, or sometimes not so subtly, diminishing, devaluing, and emotionally abusing those around her, particularly those like me, whom she perhaps perceived as possessing a quiet, authentic strength, a genuine contentment that she herself so clearly, so desperately lacked. My plan, when it finally fully crystallized in my mind, was not to engage in a series of messy private confrontations which I knew Linda would easily and expertly deflect or deny. No, my plan was far more audacious, far more public, and I hoped far more effective. The annual Evans family reunion, a large, boisterous, and traditionally sacrosanct gathering held every summer at David's parents' sprawling lakeside cabin, was just a few short weeks away. It was an event Linda always particularly relished an opportunity for her to hold court, to dispense her unsolicited advice, to subtly or not so subtly remind everyone of her own often exaggerated social and financial successes. This year, however, I decided with a cold, hard, and unshakable resolve the Evans family reunion would not be Linda's stage. It would be mine. It would be the stage upon which the truth, in all its uncomfortable, undeniable, and ultimately liberating glory, would finally and very, very publicly be revealed. The weeks leading up to the Evans family reunion were for me a period of intense, almost feverish preparation. Not of potluck dishes or carefully chosen outfits, but of a different, far more potent kind of arsenal. I meticulously organized the evidence I had gathered. The dated journal entries detailing Linda's specific slanders, the screenshots of her more egregious, if cleverly veiled social media barbs often relayed to me by sympathetic family members, as I myself had long since unfriended her, the written notarized affidavits from Chloe, from my mother-in-law, who to her credit once confronted with the undeniable pattern of her daughter's malice, had expressed profound, tearful remorse for her own past blindness and complicity, and from David's brother Michael, all corroborating Linda's long-standing pattern of manipulative, demeaning behavior towards me and others. I even with the reluctant but ultimately supportive assistance of David himself, who after a series of long, difficult, and deeply emotional conversations in which I finally unequivocally laid bare the full devastating extent of his sister's campaign against me and its impact on our daughter, had finally belatedly found his own voice, his own courage to stand with me against her, managed to obtain a few rather damning recordings of Linda made discreetly by Michael during recent family phone calls in which she, unaware she was being recorded, launched into her usual venomous tirades against my inadequacies, my social climbing, my utter lack of sophistication. The evidence was by any objective measure overwhelming, irrefutable, and utterly comprehensively damning. My plan was not to create a scene of hysterical emotional confrontation that I knew would only allow Linda to play the victim, to twist the narrative, to accuse me of being unstable, of being vindictive. No, my approach would be calm, factual, almost clinical. I would present the evidence piece by undeniable piece in a setting where she could not escape, could not deflect, could not manipulate, in front of the entire assembled Evans clan, the very audience whose good opinion, whose admiration she so desperately, so pathologically craved. The day of the reunion arrived a beautiful sun-drenched Saturday in mid-July, the kind of perfect summer day that usually filled me with a sense of relaxed familial contentment. But this year, as we drove the familiar winding road towards the lakeside cabin, my heart was not light. It was a heavy, determined drumbeat in my chest, a mixture of nervous anticipation, steely resolve, and a profound, almost unbearable sadness that it must come to this. David, seated beside me, was unusually quiet, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel, his expression a mixture of anxiety for the impending confrontation and a new, unfamiliar but deeply welcome solidarity with me. Chloe and Sam in the back seat sensed the unspoken tension. Their usual boisterous chatter subdued their young faces etched with a worried, questioning concern. I had the night before explained to them in simple age-appropriate terms that Mommy was going to have a very difficult but very important conversation with Aunt Linda, a conversation about being kind, about being truthful, about treating others with respect. They hadn't fully understood perhaps, but they had sensed the gravity and had offered me their unconditional, unquestioning, and incredibly precious love and support. The reunion itself began much as it always did. A chaotic, joyful cacophony of arriving relatives, of exuberant greetings, of children's laughter echoing through the tall pines, of the tantalizing aroma of barbecue smoke mingling with the fresh, clean scent of lake water. Linda, as usual, was holding court near the buffet table, resplendent in an expensive new sundress, her voice loud, her laughter a little too forced, her pronouncements on every conceivable subject delivered with her usual unshakable and entirely unwarranted air of absolute authority. She offered me a cursory, almost dismissive nod as I arrived, her eyes flicking over my simple cotton dress with a familiar, almost imperceptible sneer, before immediately turning back to her captivated or perhaps merely captive audience of fawning distant cousins. I waited with a patience I didn't know I possessed, through the endless superficial pleasantries, through the boisterous food-laden lunch, through the post-meal lull, when the children had dispersed to swim or play, and the adults had settled into comfortable shaded groups, their conversations a low, contented hum. And then, when the moment felt right, when a natural pause occurred in the general hubbub, when most of the key family members, including David's parents, his brother Michael, and of course Linda herself, were gathered in a loose, relaxed circle on the expansive, sun-dappled porch overlooking the shimmering lake, I took a deep, steadying breath and I stood up. "Excuse me, everyone." I began, my voice to my own surprise, clear, calm, and carrying an unexpected, almost resonant authority that immediately silenced the desultory conversations, drawing all eyes curious and a little surprised towards me. "If I could just have your attention for a few moments, please. There's something rather important that I feel I need to share with all of you. something that has been weighing heavily on my heart and on my family for a very, very long time. A hush fell over the porch. Even Linda caught mid-anecdote, her wineglass poised elegantly in her hand, looked up a flicker of something. Surprise annoyance in her usually so confident eyes. For many years now, I continued my gaze sweeping slowly, deliberately across the assembled faces, lingering for a moment on my mother-in-law, on Michael, on David, before finally inexorably settling on Linda. And by extension, my children have been the unfortunate and, I believe, entirely undeserving target of a persistent, insidious, and deeply hurtful campaign of slander, of belittlement, of emotional manipulation, orchestrated primarily and with a truly remarkable, if utterly misguided dedication by one particular member of this family. I paused, letting my words hang heavy, charged in the suddenly very still, very uncomfortable afternoon air. Linda's face, I noted with a detached, almost clinical interest, had begun to pale. Her confident smirk faltering, a tiny, almost invisible muscle, twitching nervously at the corner of her perfectly glossed lips. I have, for a very long time, I went on, my voice, still calm, still measured, but now imbued with an undeniable, unshakable undercurrent of profound, righteous anger, chosen to endure this treatment in silence. For the sake of family harmony, for the sake of my husband, for the sake of my children, I told myself that to engage, to confront, would only escalate the negativity, would only create more ugliness, more division. But I have come to realize, belatedly perhaps, but with an absolute unshakable certainty, that my silence has not brought peace. It has instead enabled, it has emboldened it, has effectively condoned this deeply damaging and entirely unacceptable behavior. And so today, here in front of all of you, the people whose opinions, whose love, whose respect supposedly matter to us all, I have chosen finally to break that silence, to speak my truth, and to present the evidence. And then, with a calm, deliberate, almost surgical precision, I did just that. I laid out piece by damning piece the irrefutable proof of Linda's long-standing malicious campaign against me. I read aloud excerpts from my dated journals detailing her specific hurtful comments, her insidious manipulations. I presented the notarized affidavits from Chloe, from my mother-in-law, from Michael, each one corroborating with painful, undeniable clarity Linda's pattern of deceit, of slander, of emotional abuse. And then, with a final devastating flourish, I took out my small, discreet digital voice recorder, the one David had with a new, steely resolve helped me to utilize during those recent innocuous family phone calls with his sister. I pressed play, and Linda's own voice, sharp, venomous, and utterly, damningly unmistakable, filled the suddenly completely silent porch. Her voice dripping with contempt, casually, cruelly dissecting my character, my parenting, my marriage, my very worth as a human being to her unsuspecting brother Michael. Her voice smugly, confidently outlining her brilliant little plan to subtly but effectively ensure that Chloe, my bright, ambitious daughter, didn't get any foolish, unrealistic ideas above her station about attending that ridiculously expensive out-of-state art college. Her voice laughing as she recounted to her mother how she had successfully, and with such delicious, ironic subtlety, managed to make me feel like a complete and utter frumpy social incompetent at the last family Christmas gathering. The impact of those recordings of Linda's own words, her own voice echoing her own treachery in that sun-dappled lakeside silence, was profound, devastating, absolute. The color drained completely from Linda's face, leaving it a ghastly mottled shade of pale green. Her wineglass slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering with a sharp, discordant crack on the wooden porch floor, the spilled red wine spreading like a pool of blood at her feet. She stared at the small, innocuous voice recorder in my hand as if it were a venomous serpent poised to strike her dead. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. No words, no denials, no excuses forthcoming. For perhaps the first time in her entire garrulous, self-assured life, Linda Evans was rendered utterly, comprehensively speechless. The rest of the Evans family, those who had been her unwitting audience, her manipulated pawns, her silent complicit enablers, looked equally, if differently, stunned, horrified, ashamed. My mother-in-law Sarah buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, heartbroken sobs. Michael David's brother stared at his sister Linda with an expression of such profound, utter disbelief, such dawning, horrified revulsion that it was almost painful to witness. And David, my husband, my once so passive, so conflict-averse, David stood silently, protectively beside me, his arm wrapped firmly, possessively around my shoulders, his gaze fixed on his younger sister with a new, unfamiliar, and deeply, chillingly formidable coldness. The silence that followed the cessation of Linda's recorded voice was absolute, broken only by my mother-in-law's muffled sobs and the distant, innocent laughter of our children still playing, blissfully unaware by the shimmering, indifferent lake. It was my father-in-law, Richard Evans, Sr., a man of few words, but I had always sensed of a deep, abiding, if often undemonstrative integrity, who finally decisively broke that terrible, loaded silence. He rose slowly, almost painfully from his wicker armchair, his gaze, usually so benign, now stern, disappointed, and utterly, unequivocally condemning, fixed squarely on his youngest daughter. Linda, he said, his voice low, gravelly, but resonating with an undeniable patriarchal authority that none of us, least of all Linda, had heard from him in many, many years. There is nothing you can say, is there? Nothing that could possibly excuse or explain or mitigate this truly despicable, shameful, and profoundly unchristian behavior. You have brought shame upon yourself, shame upon this family, and you have inflicted grievous, lasting harm upon a good, kind, and entirely undeserving woman, your own sister-in-law, and upon her innocent child. You will apologize, Linda. You will apologize to Clara and to Chloe immediately, sincerely, and with the profound, abject humility your actions so clearly, so richly deserve. And then you will leave this house, and you will not return until you have done some very deep, very serious, and very solitary soul-searching. And until you have found a way, a genuine, meaningful way, to begin to make amends for the profound, lasting damage you have so carelessly, so cruelly, so unforgivably inflicted. Linda, her face now a mask of tear-streaked, humiliated despair, didn't even attempt to argue, to protest. She simply nodded a small, broken, almost convulsive movement, then turned without a word, without meeting anyone's eye, and fled from the porch, her sobs now loud, hysterical, unrestrained, echoing in the suddenly, blessedly silent summer afternoon air. The aftermath of that dramatic, painful, but ultimately, I believed, deeply necessary family reunion reckoning was, as one might expect, complex, far-reaching, and in many ways profoundly transformative, not just for Linda, but for the entire Evans clan, and most certainly for me, Clara Evans, and for my own small, resilient family. Linda, true to her father's stern, unyielding decree, did offer me, and later, a bewildered but surprisingly composed Chloe, a tearful, almost incoherent, and I sensed genuinely, if belatedly remorseful, apology. She then, as instructed, retreated from the family orbit for a considerable period, embarking on what appeared to be a genuine, if undoubtedly arduous journey of self-reflection therapy, and eventually a slow, cautious, and very humbling attempt at personal redemption. Her path would be long, and her reintegration into the family, if it ever fully occurred, would be predicated on a demonstrated, sustained change in her character, her behavior, her fundamental understanding of respect, empathy, and basic human decency. For me, the victory was not in Linda's public humiliation, nor in her tearful, coerced apology. My victory was far more profound, far more personal than that. It was in the reclaiming of my own voice, my own dignity, my own unshakable sense of self-worth. It was in the dawning and now unwavering respect I saw in my husband David's eyes, a respect born not of obligation, but of a new, deeper understanding of my quiet, often underestimated strength, my resilience, my unwavering integrity. It was in the strengthened, more authentic bonds I now shared with my mother-in-law Sarah and with my brother-in-law Michael, bonds forged in shared truth, shared sorrow, and a new mutual commitment to fostering a healthier, more honest, and genuinely more loving family dynamic. And it was above all in the bright, confident, and once again joyfully ambitious sparkle in my daughter Chloe's eyes. The insidious, poisonous seeds of self-doubt that Linda had so cruelly, so deliberately tried to plant in her young, impressionable heart had not, thanks to our collective intervention, our unwavering love, our willingness to finally courageously speak truth to power, been allowed to take permanent damaging root. Chloe, I knew, with a mother's profound, grateful certainty, would indeed go on to attend that prestigious out-of-state art college or any other college, any other path her bright, ambitious, and now wonderfully unburdened heart desired. I had learned through this long, painful, and ultimately transformative ordeal that sometimes the hardest, most uncomfortable, and most courageous battles are not fought on distant, blood-soaked fields, but within the deceptively tranquil, often emotionally landmined terrain of our own families, our own closest relationships. I had learned that silence in the face of persistent, insidious injustice is not strength, but a slow, corrosive poison, a complicity that ultimately harms not just the victim, but the very fabric, the very soul of the family itself. And I had learned with an unshakable, empowering conviction that one person, one quiet, determined voice, armed with truth, with courage, and with an unwavering commitment to what is right, can indeed make a profound, lasting, and ultimately wonderfully redemptive difference. The scars of Linda's slander would perhaps always remain a faint, silvery reminder of a painful past, but so too would the infinitely more powerful, more beautiful, and more enduring legacy of a family that had, however belatedly, however imperfectly, chosen truth over illusion, compassion over cruelty and healing, over a legacy of silently perpetuated and ultimately soul-destroying pain.